All right, now we're going to talk about how much total surplus is missing. In other words, how much is the deadweight losses generated when a single transaction is missed, right? So there's some transaction where there's a buyer and there's a seller, and they could theoretically come to an agreement on a transaction that's mutually beneficial, right? So theoretically that could happen, but for some reason they're not, right? So the problem is, okay, suppose that Arnold's marginal benefit from buying Brenda's bicycle is $65, right? Marginal benefit is the same as willingness to pay, right? So Brenda would be willing to sell the bicycle for $35. What that means is that her marginal cost from selling the bicycle would be $35. That's essentially how much she'd be missing out on, how much benefit she'd be missing out on if she sold her bike, right? So as long as she can get more than $35 or more, she'd be willing to sell her bike, right? But let's suppose that so since Arnold has a higher marginal benefit or willingness to pay than what Brenda's marginal cost is, that means that they should, at least in theory, be able to come to some kind of an agreement where there's a mutually beneficial transaction, right? As long as the price is anywhere between $35 and $65, Arnold and Brenda would both agree to a transaction involving the bike, right? So for example, if Arnold paid $40 for the bike, well, then he'd be willing to do that because his willingness to pay his marginal benefit is $65. And Brenda would agree to selling the bike because, well, her marginal cost is only $35. So she would gladly take $40 for it. And the same is true for any other price between $35 and $65. So $40 would work, $45 would work, $50, all the way up to $65, right? If the price was $65, then Arnold would be just indifferent to buying the bike, right? Okay. So in order to analyze this and talk about, well, how much total surplus is missing if they don't agree to this transaction, right? And let's suppose that the reason that maybe the transaction might not work out is because of asymmetric information. So maybe Arnold is worried that the bike may be a lemon, right? It may be a bike that's kind of messed up and it's hard to tell just by looking at it. And he's afraid that once he gets it and brings it home and starts riding it around, then maybe it'll break, right? So Arnold's just worried about that. Right? And so that's the reason for why maybe this transaction wouldn't work out, is just because Arnold's so worried about the bike. Okay, so to analyze the deadweight loss, the missing total surplus from this transaction that's not going to happen, well, you can break up the problem into two pieces, right? You can break it up into the consumer surplus that Arnold would get from buying 1 unit of the good, right? And the consumer surplus is his willingness to pay, which is the height of his demand function, right? The marginal benefit, minus the price he pays, right? So his willingness to pay is $65. If he paid a price of $40, then his consumer surplus would be $25, right? The 65 minus the 40. If the price was 50, it'd be 65 minus 50. It's $15 worth of consumer surplus. And then likewise, you can do the same thing for the producer surplus from selling 1 unit, right? From selling this bicycle, right? So how much consumer surplus that Brenda would get, right? And her producer surplus from selling the bicycle, from selling the 1 unit of the bicycle, it's the price that she gets minus her marginal cost, right? So in her case, the marginal cost is 35. That's the minimum price that she'd be willing to sell the bike for. And so if say initially, like we said, the initial example, we said the price was 40, well, then her producer surplus would be $40 minus 35. So she would get $5 worth of producer surplus. If the price went up to 50, then it'd be 50 minus 35, so $15 worth of producer surplus, and so on and so forth, right? So that's how you would calculate both consumer surplus and producer surplus from just a single transaction, right? Buying, selling 1 unit of a good or service, right? But of course the total surplus from such a transaction would be just the sum of the consumer surplus and the producer surplus, right? So the total surplus from a 1-unit transaction, well, it's the willingness to pay for the 1 unit minus the price paid. That's the consumer surplus, right, in blue, same as up here. And then add to that the producer surplus, right? The producer surplus, that's the price minus marginal cost, so price minus marginal cost. But notice in here we can simplify this because we have willingness to pay, or the marginal benefit, minus the price, plus the price minus the marginal cost. So we're subtracting price and then adding price, which means the price essentially just cancels. And what we're left with is the willingness to pay minus the marginal cost, right? So how much is the buyer willing to pay minus how much is the seller, what is the cost to the seller of selling it, right? That is the amount of the total surplus, right? So it tells you that it doesn't matter what the price is, as long as they agree to the price that's somewhere between their marginal cost and willingness to pay, then the total surplus will be this, right? And the total surplus doesn't depend on the price, the total surplus from the one transaction, right? So in this case, the total surplus from this transaction, if it were to take place, is Arnold's willingness to pay, right? Arnold's willingness to pay is $65 minus Brenda's marginal cost, which is $35. So $65 minus $35. And so the total surplus gained from this transaction happening, where Brenda sells her bike to Arnold, would be $30. And that means that, again, if Arnold was so afraid of the asymmetric information that maybe the bike's going to break down and not work out for him, that this transaction doesn't happen, then that means that this total surplus would not occur, which means that we would have $30 worth of deadweight loss, right? So that's how much deadweight loss would happen if this one transaction didn't occur, right? It's whatever the willingness to pay is of the highest buyer minus the marginal costs, right? Okay, thank you very much for watching.